War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 74, the War 102 Weekly Update National Guard edition. So the National Guard continues to be in the news concerning Donald Trump and his attempts to bring law and order to cities that he has deemed unlawful. So this started off, well, one, he did it during his first term, during the George Floyd riots, bringing in National Guard troops to quell those disturbances. And he took some criticism there, but it was more political in nature because of the whole George Floyd thing. But he's doing it again, and he started off with Washington, D.C., where he called up the National Guard to provide law enforcement to the city. Now, the interesting thing is he has full authority to do that, but there is absolutely no restriction whatsoever for federal active duty troops to perform law enforcement functions in Washington, D.C. If you go back to January 6th, he talked about how he tried to get the National Guard to secure the Capitol based upon what he was hearing on the riots. And General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, held on to that request, as I understand it. But the really critical thing is if General Milley, either one, knew what he was doing or two, wanted to actually do something, had no requirement whatsoever to bring in a National Guard from a different state or from Washington, D.C.'s own National Guard, which is its own issue. He could have called in the 3rd Infantry Regiment or the Marines from the local bases and used them. There is zero restrictions on using active duty troops in Title X federal territories. Ordinarily, this consists of like Army bases, things like that, naval bases. But with Washington, D.C., the whole place is federal. It's whole Title X. So this use of the National Guard in Washington, D.C. is troublesome for a couple of reasons. First, we have active duty troops, and we don't have a whole lot of combat going on right now. What else are they doing? Now, I know they're training and whatnot, but they're available for the mission, and in theory, they are better trained and more responsive. Second, and more importantly, is people apparently have forgotten that National Guardsmen have real jobs outside of the National Guard. When you call up guardsmen, they have to stop work. Now, they're not going to get fired or anything, but it's a big imposition. So for the inauguration in the post-January 6th, they had National Guardsmen from every single state in Washington, D.C. doing absolutely nothing, brought in from all around the country for a publicity stunt. And my daughter-in-law, in fact, was part of that mission. She left from Texas to take part in that. And that's just a ridiculous waste of people who have other things to do. And this is specific to Washington, D.C. If you want to secure Washington, D.C., send in federal troops, send in the 82nd. I don't care who you send in. It can be anyone. But to send the National Guard is foolish. And this goes back to the idea of the Washington, D.C. National Guard. So we have Title X, which is the active duty United States Code, which covers active duty forces, federal forces, and then you have the Title 32 forces that are under control of the states and their governors. Washington, D.C. has a Title 32 National Guard that works for, wait for it, it works for the United States Army. And there's no governor. And also within each state, you have what's known as the Adjutant General, which is ordinarily the ranking National Guard officer in each state. Sometimes they're referred to as the TAG, which is the Adjutant General. So the Adjutant General is kind of foolish, but saying TAG by itself is awkward. So most people say the TAG when referring to the Adjutant General, or sometimes it's just the Adjutant General. And that is the highest ranking officer in each state that reports directly to the governor. Pretty much every state appoints, the governor directly appoints the Adjutant General. There was a state, I forget, I want to say it was Georgia or one of the southern states where the adjutant general was elected, but I don't think they do that anymore. I don't know. Not too lazy to look it up. So the National Guard of each state ultimately is commanded, when not in federal status, by the adjutant general. But Washington, D.C. has no governor, and Washington, D.C. has no adjutant general. They have a commander of the Washington, D.C. Guard, and that person reports to the active duty Title 10. At least that's the way it was 10 years ago. I don't know that they've changed it, but it's just a very stupid way of doing things. There's no reason for Washington, D.C. as a Title 10 federal enclave to have a Title 32 National Guard, and yet they do. So that's a little bit of the National Guard in Washington, D.C. So I think Trump's being too clever by half by using National Guard Title 32 guardsmen from not just Washington, D.C., but from other states in providing that mission. Now, then we come to the use of the National Guard in the actual United States of America outside of Washington, D.C., and there's some really weird things that are going on that don't make a lot of sense. So I'll give you an example. The state of Louisiana's governor has requested Donald Trump to send the Louisiana National Guard into New Orleans to provide law enforcement. Now, the Louisiana governor has no need to ask Donald Trump for authorization to take the state of Louisiana's National Guard and use it for law enforcement in the state of New Orleans, in the city of New Orleans. So what I suspect he's doing is he's asking for funding. He wants the federal government to pay the salaries and benefits for these National Guardsmen to perform this mission. I really think that's what he requested, but when I listened to him on the radio, he said, I've requested permission from Donald Trump or from the President of the United States to send my own National Guard into a city within my own state. If he really thinks that, his adjutant general, his tag, is grossly ignorant of how the whole National Guard works, and I don't think that's the case, or the governor himself is, or it just sounded more officious. I don't know, but it's stupid. Every state's National Guard works for the governor, and the governor is free to do whatever they want to with those individuals. The question, of course, is who pays. So, for example, during the Biden administration, the state of Texas sent their National Guard to the border to attempt to secure it, feeling that President Biden's immigration, customs, and border patrol, et cetera, were not doing a good enough job. All those guardsmen from Texas who were on that border mission were paid by the state of Texas in a status which is called state active duty. So the state paid all the benefits, paid all the salaries for that. And every state is free to do that, but it's very expensive. So I suspect what Louisiana was really doing was just asking for money. But the way the governor phrased it, it was very awkward. Governor Bill Lee in the state of Tennessee is doing the same thing with Memphis, although his phrasing hasn't been quite as awkward. More problematic is what's happening in Los Angeles, which I discussed earlier, where Gavin Newsom sued to stop Trump from using California Guardsmen in Title 10 status to perform law enforcement. Initially, the first judge supported Gavin Newsom's position, and then a further appellate court supported President Trump, saying that he had the authorization to do that. I disagree with that court ruling. I really hope SCOTUS comes down and clearly delineates that you cannot use, the President of the United States cannot take federal troops or even guardsmen in federal status and perform law enforcement because of the Posse Comitatus Act. And the same thing apparently is going to go on in Portland. And the states have to reclaim their sovereignty over the National Guard, over the militia. That the point of the militia is that it must be a check on too much federal overreach, on too much federal power. So if you think back, so to go over to some of the laws, you have the Posse Comitatus Act, which was passed in 1878, which was a response to Reconstruction, where the U.S. Army was used to perform law enforcement in the conquered South. Now, previous to 1878, in 1870, there was a couple of acts called the Enforcement Acts. So in 1870, 1871, the Enforcement Acts were passed, which said the federal government must ensure the constitutional rights of all citizens. And in this case, they were being very specific in the rights of blacks to vote in the South. So you had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment granting rights to blacks following the Civil War, but then you needed a mechanism to enforce them. And the Enforcement Acts were passed in 1870 and 1871. The Posse Comitatus Act was written specifically to counter the Enforcement Acts. So it would have been easier simply to repeal the acts in addition to passing Posse Comitatus to be clear about the intent. The intent was, from my perspective, clear, but both acts remain in effect. So when Dwight Eisenhower, when he was president in the 1950s, when he started enacting desegregation based on the Brown versus Board of Education, he used federal troops for law enforcement activities, and he granted himself the authority to do so from the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, stating that those overruled the Posse Comitatus Act. I disagree with that interpretation, but that happened and everyone supported it, probably because there was support for the cause under which they were used. It's much more of a stretch for President Trump to use the Enforcement Acts, as there's no explicit denial of civil rights, especially on a racial basis, in the law enforcement in the cities where he thinks the law isn't being enforced enough. And he doesn't seem to be bringing up the Enforcement Acts as his justification. In fact, I'm not really seeing much justification. I've heard that he has used, as I understand it, he's simply saying that there exists a de facto state of insurrection because the law is not being followed. But the laws not being followed are, by and large, state laws. And insurrection is a very specific thing. And I think President Trump would do well to not bandy about the word insurrection too casually. I think that's been a problem in the past few years, and he's magnifying it. But Trump does what he wants to do. So I'm looking at this from a kind of, admittedly, kind of pedantic, legalistic viewpoint, and I get if people are in high crime areas, they want it to stop. But there is a way to do what I think President Trump is trying to do and not violate not only the Posse Comitatus Act, but also the entire spirit of the militia, of the National Guard, and of state sovereignties, which under the 9th and 10th Amendment, these things are important to me, and I still think they have real value, and I think President Trump's actions are undercutting it. There are almost 200,000 federal law enforcement agencies who work for the federal government. Or not agencies, excuse me. There's 200,000 law enforcement agents who work for the federal government who are authorized to carry arms and enforce the law. Now, I think the plurality of these are TSA, which, could you really pull them off to do this mission? No, I don't know. But there are tens of thousands of investigators who are out of Washington, D.C. You think of the FBI or things like that, they are badged, they are credentialed within the law enforcement agency to enforce the law and have arrest powers. I think, especially based upon the numbers of troops that we're talking about, they're in the hundreds. There's hundreds of National Guardsmen who are doing these missions in these various places. And I think President Trump would be much better suited to use federal law enforcement agents to actually enforce the law, whether they be state laws or federal laws in these cities. One, it would kind of push out a lot of the people who are in Washington, D.C., and having spent a couple of years in Washington, D.C., I'm not real impressed with what they do. But more importantly, it would protect the spirit of the Constitution and the spirit of which the National Guard is and maintain state sovereignty to a certain degree. Some may remember that when President Obama was in office, he spoke of there being a requirement for a civilian federal agency as strong and as large and as powerful as the U.S. military, which caused a bit of concern from a number of people saying, well, what would you do with 1.2 million people who are as powerful and as strong as the U.S. military, assuming helicopters and tanks and whatnot? What it would do is completely bypass any sort of restrictions on the use of the National Guard and on active duty forces, the Title X forces, to do various law enforcement activities. it was a concerning statement from President Obama, but it did show a recognition of the restrictions he felt the active duty military was under in performing law enforcement, which I agree with him in the perspective that, yes, you should restrict these activities in accordance with the law and the Constitution, but having a 1.2 million man federal law enforcement agency would be really a bad idea. So that's kind of my take on what's going on with the National Guard. And I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this. I really don't care. But I think the short-term gains of law enforcement can be done by other means that don't violate the Constitution and the law. And I do believe that President Trump is violating the law, even if it is for what he seems to think is a good cause, which is protecting people and enforcing the law. I think that is a good goal, but we shouldn't do it by unconstitutional means. So that's my 2 cents. Let me know what you think. Next week I'll be back with some other battle that probably no one really cares about, but I found interesting. So till then, I'll talk to you later. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.